Ah, oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Well, thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Bart Simon. I'm a professor at Concordia University in Montreal. And I'm giving a short little, what is it, a précis of work I'm doing on with the title of Discoverability Now. It more in the Seinfeldian sense of the term, um, to talk about the way in which discoverability has become a somewhat of a mantra amongst all sectors, including AAA, and in the cultural sectors at large. It's not just even about games, but about cultural production in general, this language of discoverability, which seems to have replaced an older language, which might be called the language of marketing. So the motivation for this project comes from a grant that we received in partnership with Gameplay Space, which is a co-working space in Montreal that many of you have heard of or have worked with me to explore. You know, we could start by saying discoverability, or what we call discoverability, is just a euphemism for something that's been going on for a very long time. And not even just in the arena of cultural production or in terms of production consumption in general. You know, if I am have an idea and I want to communicate that idea, part of my problem in communicating that idea could be thought of as a discoverability problem. I would like you to listen to my idea and do something with it, acknowledge it, agree with me, ideally agree with me, support me, and so on and so forth. But if I talk into thin air and nobody hears me, I've got a problem. Fundamental problem. And this is before I'm even trying to sell anything. Communication and discovery, in that simple sense of the term, go hand in hand. So discoverability is a relational concept, and it's an interactional concept, and it's a communications concept. So there's always an element of discoverability involved in any interaction or in any communication. Or so that gets translated into game development in terms of the discoverability problem. I make a game, I ship the game, I put it on Steam or whatever, but if nobody sees it, then nobody can buy it, and I'm sunk. We have a situation where we have a bunch of games going to market, and not enough of those games are being discovered. Um, and this is especially true in the case of indies who are competing for noticeability with AAA. So AAA studios with their massive marketing departments and everything is planned coherently together. So marketing and game development often go hand in hand. Sometimes marketing even dictates game development. So discoverability in that sense is built in right from day one in terms of AAA production flows. But for indies, it's not normally, or it's not generally conceived to be as part and parcel of the game development process proper. So there's a game development process, and then there's a discoverability problem. So discoverability is a term which kind of gets away from the notion of the extra cost and labor of marketing, and sort of reframes that as something that individuals with little or no economic resources can do. Right, so you don't have to have a marketing budget to do discoverability, to make your games discoverable. And so when we were tracking this and we were trying to say, well, what do we mean by discoverability? What do developers mean? What do non-developers who are telling developers to get into discoverability mean when they talk about discoverability? Is generally a set of practices, advice, attitudes, orientations to the game development process, which allows for game developers to think about the noticeability, the relative noticeability or not of their games. Okay, so let's continue with this discussion about discoverability. So in our interviews and across the data, I would say generally we can isolate three categories or three forms of discoverability work and discoverability talk. The first one is the closest correlation to I guess what you call old world or classical marketing, which would be the notion of what I would call spectacular noticeability, or the idea that to be noticeable, to be discoverable, one has to stand out from the or one's game, or actually, since one is also marketing the studio and the developers as well as the game itself, marking oneself and one's game as different than others in the market. But now we're talking about how a game gets presented in the Steam store, how it gets reviewed and supported, and these will all go into classical, what I call sort of spectacular noticeability. The one big difference, so this is not a huge dimension of discoverability in general, except for a new dimension which is increasingly important in terms of indie scene in general. And that's the difference between what might be called direct marketing and business to business marketing, B2B as they call it, where the marketing transaction is not with the consumer, directly with the consumer, but with another company or business venture, which is going to translate that game into direct marketing themselves. So the most prominent example of that is the relationship between game developers and social media influencers. And so trying to make your game discoverable by social media influencers is actually more of a B2B or business to business marketing or discoverability problem than it is a matter of sales to new consumers or new players. And this was one of the key drivers of the IP discoverability engine project, was to create a set of programs that would introduce game developers to social media influencers, especially in the local community around Montreal, to begin to develop that relationship. And the sense in which influencers are part of the cultural intermediary system of indie game development writ large comes really to the fore in the IP discoverability engine project, in this attempt to try to develop a transactional culture between game developers and influencers. I mean, and literally, this is an economic exchange, so you're paying influencers for their time to attend to your game, so that your game is directly marketed to the influencers' fan base via their streams. Uh, no matter what, that comes under the heading of what I'm calling spectacular noticeability, how to portray one's game as being different than others or standing out in a pack. Just this idea of reaching up above the crowd and getting noticed. And that's to be distinguished from a second, probably much more prevalent set of discourses around discoverability, which has to do with social media analytics, and the notion of literally what I would call playing the algorithm. This is not direct marketing at all, and in fact, there's very little communication with consumers that occurs directly in this kind of social media discoverability, but is a matter of actually communicating to the algorithms, or representing one's game to the algorithms, the social media algorithms, be it Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or any of these other sorts of things, for if you like, the network effect of display and dissemination and consumption. So one is consuming, the goal is, right, to spread representational traces of one's game throughout the social network, leveraging to the best of one's ability the algorithms that govern these platforms to do that work for you, essentially serve as your marketing team. Now, folks like David Nyborg and other people have written about this in huge detail, and so I'm not, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it at this conference, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but in fact, the vast majority of advice, commentary, discourse, and labor that goes on around discoverability happens to do with social media. Playing the algorithm, as I call it. So if we talk about spectacular noticeability on the one hand, which is connected with traditional marketing, but really what's important is the business-to-business marketing dimensions of this in the case of indies. The playing the algorithm or social media analytics, which is another form of discoverability labor and discoverability talk. And the final one, actually, we never thought would come under discoverability, but actually does, which is community management. So the idea that making one's game noticeable actually depends on a set of beyond consumer relationship, producer-consumer relationship with players. So constituting players as communities becomes part of the labor of discoverability. That is, one is literally constituting one's market for the sake of being noticed by that market. And of course, there are all kinds of spin-on effects of this, because you're in old style marketing, this would be equated with word of mouth marketing or something like that, where it's your community that starts doing the representational, the sort of the dissemination of representational traces of the game through informal communication rather than formal communication. So there's no set plan. There's just a buzz. That's what buzz is. And of course, this bleeds into social media, and it bleeds into business-to-business marketing, but the work of making community becomes a little bit conflated with the work of doing discoverability. And this we found to be super interesting. So just let me put a caveat on that, right? So in terms of our methodology, we're tracking a number of things. So how discoverability gets talked about by non-developers, and how discoverability gets talked about and done by developers. And one of the things we definitely noticed is that non-developers, especially business consultants, lean very heavily on the social media analytics and playing the algorithms, and on spectacular noticeability, traditional marketing, and business-to-business marketing. And developers, I guess maybe we could have intuited this, tend to lie a little bit closer to the notion of community management in relationship to discoverability. Now, all of this is extra work, above and beyond what normally most developers think of as game development. So it's always seen as extra, above and beyond, a pain in the ass, something they'd rather not do. They'd rather spend, I say this generally, this is not every individual developer we've talked to, but they certainly all talk to the extra labor that's required. So yeah, so in this last section of the presentation, I want to talk about where we're headed with the project in terms of this discussion of the differences between the kinds of discoverability talk and discoverability work that go on. And I'm not particularly interested in here right now the critique of discoverability talk. That's certainly been taken up elsewhere, and there's a lot to talk about with respect to it in terms of how discoverability talk is starting to drive even the conceptualization of games in a certain direction. That is, that developers are increasingly being told and sort of feeling the pressure to only develop games that they think can be discoverable or more discoverable, especially via social media, playing the algorithm types of discoverability work. And this, of course, has a huge danger in terms of lot of the hopes and dreams we have for the indie game sector. So I would pick that up in discussion. Instead, I want to talk about an opposite trend I think is maybe interesting and might give us also an inroad into new avenues for theorizing with respect to game production, which I think would be promising. So one of the things that seems absolutely clear is that the demand, the external, but also the internal. So there's an external demand for discoverability on the part of, I suppose, industry watchers, people who certainly care about the success of game development studios, seemingly wanting to advise those studios on how to do better, but also internally, because the failure rate of indie game studios is very, very high. And of course, it makes sense to figure out what can you do to increase your chances of survival. So in a sense, you're looking for any strategies possible. In comes discoverability talk as a way of sort of at least trying to think through the problems of maintaining an indie game studio. So you're going to wrestle with that, you're going to deal with that. And one of the things I think is really interesting is the way in which discoverability talk, for better or for worse, pushes game developers to think more seriously about what constitutes audiences. Who are the players? What do they want? Where do they exist? Where they haven't been thought about before. Making oneself noticeable. The act of trying to make oneself noticeable is actually an interesting social act. Trying to make oneself heard and understandable by different kinds of people. So in a sense, it's an outward-looking kind of relationality, right? It's a sort of, I'm now quite not so concerned about my own needs and my own desires. I have to be quite concerned about the needs and desires of others, because I'm going to reformulate what I do and how I speak and what I say in terms of how I perceive the concerns of others. And this is pretty important shift when thinking about cultural production, because of course it's a long-standing element of cultural production of all sorts is the idea of cultural autonomy, the sense in which the artist as a cultural producer has a right and a responsibility to create what they feel is important, what they feel is interesting, what they desire. And that notion of autonomy and freedom is sort of kind of like embedded in our traditions of cultural production. And it's certainly true when thinking about indie as one of the ways in which we articulate the difference between indiness, for instance, and AAA and mainstream, a desire for autonomy, a desire to create the games that you want to make. But with that desire comes a reproduction of this divide between the producer and the consumer, the artist and the audience, which plagues cultural production in all of its forms. And when it comes to the sustainability of that production, that divide can be problematic. So anything which gets the artist, the maker, the producer to think about the context and the audience of their production may be actually an interestingly promising thing, even if it comes with negative consequences. So one of the things that we notice is an increase with discoverability talk, is an increase of thinking about community management. As I was talking about with developers, even when it looks like that's a lot of extra work and it's unpaid labor and so on and so forth. But that has interesting repercussions in terms of thinking about the medium itself. So one of the things we could go back to is the old arguments about medium specificity when it comes to games. Games do not work like other cultural products. That is, the game doesn't exist until it's played, and if it doesn't exist until it's played, the players are an essential part of that production. And in a sense, we don't make games for players, we only make games with players, and players are a component of the assemblage of the game itself. And perhaps discoverability talk, which drives discoverability work in the form of community management, actually pushes us closer to what we might call a kind of realization of the medium as a truly interactive medium in which production and consumption co-produce the product itself. And this, I think, is what's interesting about discoverability. Yes, it's a fad. Yes, it's a lot of extra labor. There's a lot of larger, I would say, political economic repercussions to shifting away from incubation towards discoverability. Lots of elements going on, but I'm very intrigued about discoverability in terms of what it's telling us about what the medium is and how games work as truly interactive media, as opposed to reproducing the divide between production and consumption, which plagues cultural production in general. So that's kind of where I'm at. Ugh, that was a lot and not very specific, but a kind of overview, maybe lots of ways into some kind of conversation. Thanks so much for listening to me. And I hope I never have to do this video talk kind of thing again, because I'd rather talk to you in person. Thanks.